courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters jostling for position in the gallery, their cameras trained on the defense table where 13-year-old Marcus Holloway sat in an orange jumpsuit that seemed too large for his small frame. His blonde hair was neatly combed, his blue eyes wide and innocent-looking, the very picture of a child caught in circumstances beyond his control. But those who had followed the case knew better. For Marcus, this trial was not about justice or truth. It was a stage, and he was the star performer. He sat with his shoulders back, chin slightly raised, a faint trace of something that could have been confidence or contempt playing at the corners of his mouth. The charge was involuntary manslaughter in the death of his 7-year-old sister, Emma Holloway. But as the prosecution would soon reveal, the truth was far darker, far more calculated, far more monstrous than anyone could have imagined. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of rage or passion. This was cold-blooded, premeditated murder, captured on video by the killer himself. And as the evidence unfolded, Marcus Holloway's carefully constructed performance would crumble, his mask would slip, and the full horror of what he had done would be laid bare before a horrified courtroom. The only question was how long he could maintain the illusion of innocence before the smoking gun shattered everything. The bailiff's voice rang out across the packed courtroom. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Thornton. The assembled crowd rose as one. A sea of faces turned toward the bench as Judge Thornton entered, her black robes flowing behind her, her expression stern and unreadable. She was a woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had presided over countless cases in her 30 years on the bench. But this one, everyone knew, would be different. This one would test the very foundations of justice itself. "Please be seated," Judge Thornton said, her voice carrying authority that silenced even the rustling of papers. "We are here today in the matter of the state of Texas versus Marcus Allen Holloway. Will the defendant please rise?" Marcus stood slowly, deliberately, making sure to keep his movements measured and controlled. His public defender, a harried-looking man named Gerald Preston, who had been assigned the case just 3 weeks prior, stood beside him. Preston's face was already showing the strain of defending a client who refused to listen to reason, who insisted on playing to the cameras, who seemed to believe he was untouchable. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Thornton continued, "you are charged with involuntary manslaughter in the death of Emma Rose Holloway on the evening of March 15th, 2024. How do you plead?" Marcus turned slightly, just enough to catch the lens of the nearest camera, and said in a clear, steady voice that carried a trace of wounded innocence, "Not guilty, Your Honor. I would never hurt my sister. This was an accident. A terrible, terrible accident." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen, a woman of 42 with jet black hair and an expression that suggested she had already seen through every lie Marcus Holloway could tell, made a note on her legal pad. She had been with the district attorney's office for 18 years, and she had prosecuted her share of difficult cases. But nothing had prepared her for this. A 13-year-old boy who had murdered his baby sister and then had the audacity to film it, to document his own crime with such casual disregard for human life that it defied comprehension. "Very well," Judge Thornton said. "Mr. Preston, does your client understand the charges against him?" "He does, Your Honor," Preston replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He had tried multiple times to explain to Marcus the severity of his situation, but the boy simply would not listen. Marcus believed he was smarter than everyone in the room, that he could charm and manipulate his way out of this, just as he had charmed and manipulated his way through life up until now. "Ms. Chen," Judge Thornton continued, "you may proceed with your opening statement." Rebecca Chen rose from her seat with the fluid grace of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. She walked to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself so that she could address both the jury and the gallery simultaneously. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what you are about to hear over the course of this trial will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of evil. We often think of evil as something that comes from the outside, something foreign and monstrous. But sometimes, evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it sits at the dinner table. Sometimes it shares a bedroom with its victim." Marcus maintained his expression of wounded innocence. But there was a flicker, just for a moment, something cold and calculating that passed behind his eyes before he suppressed it. "The defendant wants you to believe that Emma Holloway's death was an accident," Chen continued. "He wants you to believe that he loved his sister, that he would never intentionally harm her, that what happened on the night of March 15th was a tragic mishap, a moment of brotherly roughhousing that went too far. But the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, will tell a very different story. The evidence will show that Marcus Holloway planned his sister's murder for weeks. The evidence will show that he carried out that murder with cold precision. And most damningly, the evidence will show that he documented his crime, that he filmed himself committing this atrocity, creating a record of his actions that leaves absolutely no room for doubt." There was a collective intake of breath from the gallery. Several reporters leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously. Marcus's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the edge of the defense table. "Over the course of this trial," Chen said, her voice gaining strength, "you will hear from investigators who will describe the crime scene. You will hear from forensic experts who will explain how Emma died. You will hear from witnesses who will testify to the defendant's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the murder. And you will see, with your own eyes, the evidence that proves beyond any shadow of doubt that Marcus Holloway is guilty not of involuntary manslaughter, but of first-degree murder. Thank you." She returned to her seat, and Judge Thornton turned to the defense table. "Mr. Preston, your opening statement." Preston stood, and it was clear from his body language that he was already fighting a losing battle. "Your Honor, members of the jury, my client is 13 years old. He is a child. Yes, a tragedy occurred. Yes, Emma Holloway died. And that is something that will haunt this family forever. But we must remember that children, especially children who are dealing with their own developmental challenges, do not always understand the consequences of their actions. Marcus and Emma were playing. What happened was an accident. A terrible accident, but an accident nonetheless. The prosecution will try to paint my client as a monster, but I ask you to remember that he is a boy, a confused and frightened boy who made a terrible mistake. Thank you." It was weak, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Preston returned to his seat, and Marcus leaned over to whisper something in his ear. Whatever he said made Preston's jaw tighten, but he nodded curtly and turned his attention back to the judge. "Miss Chen, call your first witness," Judge Thornton instructed. "The state calls Detective James Morrison to the stand." Detective Morrison was a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen too much darkness in his career. He took the stand and was sworn in, his hand steady on the Bible as he affirmed to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "Detective Morrison," Chen began, "can you please describe your role in this investigation?" "I'm the lead detective on the case," Morrison said, his voice gruff but clear. I was called to the Holloway residence on the evening of March 15th, 2024, at approximately 8:45 in the evening. And what did you find when you arrived? Morrison's expression darkened. I found a scene of extreme violence. Emma Holloway, age 7, was lying in the upstairs hallway. She had sustained multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her head and torso. There was blood on the walls, on the carpet, evidence of a prolonged and brutal attack. Objection, Preston said, rising quickly. Inflammatory language. Sustained, Judge Thornton said. Detective, please stick to the facts. Yes, Your Honor, Morrison said. He turned back to Chen. The victim had sustained injuries consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. Based on the blood spatter patterns and the positioning of the body, it appeared the attack had begun in the bedroom she shared with her brother and continued into the hallway. And where was the defendant when you arrived? He was downstairs in the living room with his parents. He appeared calm, almost unnaturally so. When I asked him what happened, he told me that he and Emma had been playing, that she had fallen and hit her head. But the injuries were not consistent with a fall. They were consistent with an assault. What did you do next? I secured the scene and called for additional officers and crime scene investigators. Then I separated the family members and began conducting preliminary interviews. The defendant's story was inconsistent from the start. He claimed they were playing tag, that Emma tripped over a toy and fell down the stairs. But there were no stairs between the bedroom and where her body was found. When I pointed that out, he changed his story, said she fell in the bedroom and he tried to help her, but she hit her head again in the hallway. Did you find these explanations credible? No, ma'am. The forensic evidence did not support any accidental fall scenario. This was clearly a case of homicidal violence. Chen walked back to her table and picked up a thick folder. Detective Morrison, can you walk us through what happened after you secured the scene? Of course. I called in our crime scene unit. They arrived within 20 minutes. We photographed everything, every angle, every surface, every drop of blood. We documented the position of the body, the location of potential weapons, the trajectory of blood spatter on the walls. We collected samples for laboratory analysis. We bagged the victim's clothing. We searched for fingerprints, fibers, any trace evidence that might tell us what happened in that room. How long did this process take? The initial crime scene processing took approximately 6 hours. We did not leave the residence until almost 3 o'clock in the morning. We wanted to make sure we had everything, that we missed nothing. And what did you discover during this processing? Morrison pulled out his own notes. We found a baseball bat under the defendant's bed. It appeared to have been recently wiped down, but there were still traces of biological material in the grooves of the wood. We found the defendant's cell phone on his desk, powered off. We found clothing in the laundry hamper that had blood spatter consistent with being worn during a violent assault. We found the journal I mentioned earlier. And we found something else. We found a practice area. Can you explain what you mean by a practice area? In the back corner of the defendant's closet, behind his hanging clothes, we found a section of wall that had been repeatedly struck with what appeared to be the same baseball bat. There were impact marks, indentations in the drywall, places where the bat had punched completely through. It looked like someone had been practicing their swing, testing how hard they could hit. The courtroom fell silent. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Did you collect samples from this area? We did. We removed sections of the damaged drywall for analysis. And we found something interesting. Some of the impact marks contain traces of biological material, hair follicles. When we tested them, they came back as belonging to Emma Holloway. So the defendant had been practicing hitting his sister with a baseball bat in his closet. Preston shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. The witness cannot know what the defendant was or was not practicing. Sustained, Judge Thornton said. Rephrase, Ms. Chen. Detective Morrison, based on your analysis of the physical evidence, what conclusions did you draw about the practice area in the defendant's closet? Based on the presence of the victim's hair in the impact marks, it appeared that the defendant had struck the victim with the baseball bat on previous occasions, possibly as a form of testing or practice before the fatal assault. Chen let that sink in before continuing. Detective, after you finished processing the crime scene, what did you do next? I conducted a formal interview with the defendant at the police station. His parents were present, as required by law when interviewing a minor. I read him his rights. He said he understood them and agreed to speak with me. What did he tell you during this interview? He stuck to his story about it being an accident, but his demeanor was strange. Most people, when they are being questioned about the death of a loved one, show some emotion. Grief, anger, confusion, something. But the defendant showed nothing. He answered my questions calmly, almost robotically. At one point, I asked him how he felt about his sister being gone, and he paused for a long moment before saying, "I guess I am sad." But his facial expression did not match his words. There was no sadness there. If anything, he looked annoyed that I was asking. Did his parents notice this disconnect? His mother did. I saw her looking at him with an expression that was hard to read. It was like she was seeing him clearly for the first time and not liking what she saw. His father seemed to be in shock, unable to process what was happening. What happened after the interview? We arrested the defendant and charged him with involuntary manslaughter. At that time, we believed it might have been a case of excessive force during a sibling fight that went too far. But as our investigation continued, as we analyzed the evidence and recovered data from his phone, we realized the truth was much darker. Preston stood for cross-examination. Detective Morrison, you testified that my client appeared calm during your interview. Is it not possible that he was in shock? That he was traumatized by what had happened? It is possible, Morrison conceded. But in my 28 years of experience, I have interviewed hundreds of people who were in shock or traumatized. Their affect is different. They are disoriented, confused, they repeat themselves. They have trouble focusing. The defendant showed none of those signs. He was lucid, coherent, and very much in control of himself. But you cannot read minds, can you, detective? You cannot know for certain what my client was feeling? No, I cannot read minds. But I can read behavior. And the defendant's behavior was not consistent with someone who had accidentally killed a loved one. It was consistent with someone who was trying to convince me of a lie. Preston pressed on. You mentioned that you found a baseball bat under my client's bed. Is it not common for children to keep sports equipment in their bedrooms? It is. But it is not common for that sports equipment to have the victim's blood and tissue embedded in it, despite attempts to clean it. You also mentioned finding a practice area in the closet. But you do not actually know when those impact marks were made, do you? They could have been there for months or years. The drywall dust and debris were still fresh. Based on the condition of the damaged area, I would estimate those impacts were made within days or weeks of the murder, not months or years. Preston tried a few more questions, but he was getting nowhere. Detective Morrison was an experienced witness who knew how to handle cross-examination. After 10 more minutes of fruitless questioning, Preston sat down, and the prosecution called their next witness. The medical examiner, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the calm, clinical demeanor of someone who dealt with death as a daily reality. She took the stand and was sworn in. "Dr. Hartwell," Chen began, "can you please describe your qualifications?" "I am a board-certified forensic pathologist with 23 years of experience. I have conducted over 4,000 autopsies during my career. I am the chief medical examiner for Harris County, Texas." "And did you perform the autopsy on Emma Holloway?" "I did, on the morning of March 16th, 2024. "Can you describe your findings?" Hartwell opened a thick folder containing her autopsy report and photographs. Emma Holloway was a well-nourished 7-year-old female child measuring 48 inches in height and weighing 52 pounds. She had sustained multiple traumatic injuries, primarily to the head and upper body. "Can you be more specific about these injuries?" The victim sustained 7 separate impact wounds to the skull. 3 were located on the right side of the head, 2 on the left side, and 2 on the back of the skull. Each impact had fractured the skull and caused significant damage to the underlying brain tissue. Additionally, the victim had sustained 4 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, and multiple contusions and abrasions on her face, neck, and torso. "In your professional opinion, doctor, what caused these injuries?" The injuries were consistent with being struck multiple times with a cylindrical blunt object, such as a baseball bat. The pattern and spacing of the impact wounds matched the dimensions of the bat recovered from the defendant's bedroom. Could these injuries have been caused by a fall? Absolutely not. The multiplicity and distribution of the injuries, combined with the force required to fracture a skull in 7 separate locations, rule out any accidental fall scenario. These injuries could only have been caused by repeated, deliberate strikes with significant force. Chen walked closer to the witness stand. "Dr. Hartwell, can you tell us about the sequence of these injuries? In what order were they inflicted?" "Based on the blood flow patterns and the nature of the wounds, I can reconstruct the sequence to some degree. The first blow appears to have been to the back of the head, possibly while the victim was facing away or attempting to flee. This blow would have caused significant pain and disorientation, but would not have been immediately fatal. The victim then received blows to the sides of the head and to the torso, breaking ribs and causing additional head trauma. The final blows were delivered while the victim was on the ground, likely unconscious or semi-conscious. These final blows were what ultimately caused death." "How long would this assault have taken?" "Based on the injuries and the blood evidence at the scene, I would estimate the assault lasted between 2 and 4 minutes. The victim would have been conscious and aware for at least the first minute, possibly longer." Several jury members looked visibly ill. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. In the gallery, Emma's mother let out a small, choked sound of anguish. "Dr. Hartwell, would Emma have suffered during this attack?" Preston objected. "Your Honor, this is inflammatory and irrelevant." "I will allow it," Judge Thornton said. "The victim's suffering is relevant to establishing the brutality of the crime." Hartwell's expression was grim. "Yes, Emma would have suffered tremendously. The initial blows would have caused severe pain. She would have been conscious and aware that she was being attacked. She would have felt each impact, each broken bone. She would have experienced terror and confusion and pain. Her final moments were spent in agony, being beaten to death by someone she should have been able to trust." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled crying from the gallery. Chen continued her questioning. "Doctor, did you find any evidence that Emma attempted to defend herself?" "Yes. There were defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, bruises and abrasions consistent with trying to block or deflect blows. There were also fibers under her fingernails that matched the fabric of the defendant's clothing, suggesting she grabbed at him or tried to push him away. So she fought back? She tried. But she was a 7-year-old child fighting against a much larger and stronger 13-year-old who was armed with a weapon. She had no chance." Chen returned to her table and retrieved a series of photographs. "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence photographs from the autopsy. I warn the court that these images are graphic." Judge Thornton nodded. "So noted. Proceed." The photographs were displayed on the courtroom monitors. Several people in the gallery looked away. The images showed Emma's small body on the autopsy table, the full extent of her injuries visible. Her skull was misshapen from the fractures. Her face was swollen and discolored. The clinical nature of the autopsy photographs somehow made them even more heartbreaking, reducing this little girl who had loved to draw horses and wanted to be a veterinarian to a collection of wounds and measurements. Marcus stared at the photographs with an expression that was hard to read. Was it guilt? Fascination? Regret? Or was it simply the realization that these images were damning evidence against him? Preston's cross-examination of the medical examiner was brief. There was little he could challenge. The autopsy findings were clear and well documented. He tried to get Hartwell to concede that the defendant might not have intended to kill his sister, that perhaps he did not understand how much force he was using. But Hartwell shut that down immediately. "The defendant delivered 7 blows to the victim's skull," she said firmly. "After the first blow, it would have been obvious that he was causing serious injury. After the second or third blow, it would have been obvious that he was potentially causing fatal injury. Yet he continued. He struck her 4 more times after it would have been clear he was killing her. That is not lack of understanding. That is intent." The prosecution continued building their case methodically over the following days. They called the crime scene technicians who had processed the Holloway residence, who testified about the blood evidence, the location of the weapon, the pattern of violence that was impossible to explain away as an accident. They called the forensic analyst who had tested the baseball bat, who explained in precise detail how they had found Emma's blood, hair, and tissue embedded in the wood grain despite the defendant's attempts to clean it. The analyst described using luminol to reveal blood that was invisible to the naked eye, showing how the bat had been used as a weapon multiple times, not just on the night of the murder. They called a forensic computer specialist who had examined Marcus's search history in the weeks leading up to the murder. The specialist testified that Marcus had searched for information about how to commit the perfect crime, how long it takes someone to die from head trauma, whether a juvenile could be charged with murder, and how to delete data from a cell phone. The defendant searched for this information repeatedly, the specialist testified. On March 1st, 2 weeks before the murder, he searched for "Can a 13-year-old go to adult prison?" On March 8th, he searched for "How to make a death look like an accident." On March 13th, just 2 days before the murder, he searched for "How long does it take to delete phone data permanently?" Each search query was displayed on the monitors, a digital trail of premeditation that destroyed any pretense that this had been a spontaneous act or an accident. They called Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who testified about Emma's behavior in the weeks before her death. Emma became withdrawn, Mrs. Rodriguez said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She had always been such a bright, cheerful child. But in February and March, something changed. She stopped participating in class. She seemed afraid. Several times I asked her if everything was okay at home, and she would start to say something, but then stop herself. I wish, God, how I wish. I had pushed harder, asked more questions. Did Emma ever mention her brother? Chen asked. Yes. Once, about a week before she died, I saw her drawing during free time. She was drawing a picture of her family, but she had scribbled out one of the figures with a black crayon. When I asked her about it, she said it was her brother. I asked her why she had scribbled him out, and she just looked at me with these big, sad eyes and said, "Because he is mean to me, and I wish he would go away." The testimony continued, painting a picture of a little girl who had been terrorized in her own home, who had tried to signal that something was wrong but who had not been heard, and a calculating older brother who had planned her demise with chilling precision. Then came the testimony from Marcus's own parents, David and Susan Holloway. They took the stand looking like ghosts, hollow-eyed and broken. The prosecutor handled them gently, knowing that they were victims too, in a different way. Susan Holloway's hands trembled as she clutched a tissue. "Mrs. Holloway," Chen said gently, "can you describe your son's relationship with Emma?" Susan's voice was barely above a whisper. "They were siblings. They fought sometimes, like all siblings do. But Marcus, he was always so good at explaining things away. If Emma came to us with a bruise, Marcus would say they were playing too rough. If she was crying, he would say she was being dramatic. And we believed him. God help us, we believed him. He was our son. We thought we knew him." Mrs. Holloway, did there come a time when you began to suspect that Marcus might be hurting Emma deliberately? Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, about a month before it happened, I started noticing things. Emma would flinch when Marcus came near her. She started asking if she could sleep in our room. She said she was having bad dreams, but I think now she was afraid to sleep in the room with Marcus. And one night, I heard her crying. I went to check on her, and Marcus was standing over her bed, just staring down at her. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he heard her crying and came to check on her. But the expression on his face, it was not concern. It was something else. Something cold. What did you do? I talked to my husband. We discussed getting Marcus evaluated, maybe getting him into therapy. We knew something was not right. But Marcus, he can be very charming when he wants to be. He apologized. He said he was just worried about his sister. He promised to be nicer to her. And we wanted to believe him. What parent wants to think their child might be dangerous? Mrs. Holloway, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about the night Emma died. Can you tell the court what happened? Susan took a shuddering breath. David and I were downstairs. It was a normal evening. Marcus and Emma went upstairs after dinner. Marcus said they were going to play video games. About an hour later, we heard screaming. Emma was screaming for help, screaming for us. We ran upstairs and her voice broke. There was blood everywhere. Emma was on the floor in the hallway, not moving, and Marcus was standing there. He looked at us and said, "I think she fell." Just like that, like he was commenting on the weather. "I think she fell." There was no emotion in his voice, no panic, no fear, just this flat, empty statement. "What did you do?" David called 911 while I tried to help Emma, but I could see she was already gone. There was so much blood. Her head, it was. Susan could not continue. She broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs. Judge Thornton called for a brief recess to allow the witness to compose herself. When they resumed, David Holloway took the stand. His testimony echoed his wife's, describing a son who had always been different, who had always seemed disconnected from normal human emotion, who they had known was troubled but had never imagined capable of murder. "Mr. Holloway," Chen asked, "in the days following Emma's death, did you have any conversations with your son about what happened?" David nodded slowly. "Yes. He was in custody, but I was allowed to visit him. I asked him why. Why would he do this to Emma? To us? To himself? And do you know what he said?" "What did he say?" "He said Emma was annoying, that she was always in his space, always demanding attention, always crying. He said he just wanted peace and quiet. He said it like he was explaining why he had thrown away a broken toy, not why he had murdered his sister. There was no remorse, no understanding that he had done something monstrous. He just wanted me to understand that from his perspective, it made sense." The courtroom was silent except for the occasional sound of someone crying quietly in the gallery. "Did your son ever express regret or remorse for what he had done?" "No, never. Not once. When I started crying, telling him how much Emma meant to us, how much we loved her, he looked at me with this expression of mild confusion, like he could not understand why I was upset. It was like talking to an alien, someone who could mimic human behavior but did not actually understand it." Preston's cross-examination was careful. He tried to suggest that David and Susan had failed to get Marcus the help he needed, that they bore some responsibility for what had happened. But it backfired. The jury saw grieving parents who had lost one child to murder and another child to his own monstrous nature. They saw a family destroyed, and they saw that Marcus, sitting at the defense table maintaining his performance of innocence, felt nothing for any of it. The trial moved into its second week, and with each passing day, the evidence mounted. The prosecution called a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Marcus during the investigation. "Dr. Michael Torres, can you please describe your evaluation of the defendant?" Dr. Torres, a man in his 40s with a neat beard and wire-rimmed glasses, consulted his notes. "I conducted 3 separate evaluation sessions with Marcus Holloway, totaling approximately 6 hours of direct interaction. I also reviewed his school records, medical records, and family history." "And what were your findings?" "Marcus presents with classic symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder, combined with antisocial traits. He demonstrates a grandiose sense of self-importance, a belief that he is special and should be treated accordingly. He shows a complete lack of empathy for others. He is manipulative and charming when it serves his interests, but becomes hostile and dismissive when challenged. Most concerning, he shows no genuine emotional response to the suffering of others." "Can you give us specific examples from your evaluation?" "During our second session, I showed Marcus photographs of his sister from before her death. Happy photos of her playing, smiling, living her life. I asked him what he felt when he looked at these pictures. He studied them for several moments and then said, 'She looks annoying.' I asked him to elaborate, and he said that even in the pictures, he could tell she was the kind of person who would be irritating to be around. There was no sadness, no grief, no acknowledgement that this was his sister who was now dead because of his actions." "Did you conduct any standardized psychological tests?" "Yes. I administered the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, youth version, a standardized assessment tool used to evaluate psychopathic traits in juveniles. Marcus scored a 32 out of 40, which places him in the high range for psychopathic traits. For context, Most adolescents score below 15. What does this score tell you about the defendant? It tells me that Marcus lacks the fundamental, emotional and moral components that govern most human behavior. He does not feel guilt or remorse. He does not experience empathy. He views other people as objects to be used or discarded based on his needs and wants. He is capable of understanding intellectually that murder is wrong and illegal, but he does not feel on an emotional level that it is wrong. The moral prohibition against hurting others simply does not exist for him. In your professional opinion, Dr. Torres, did Marcus understand that killing his sister was wrong? Intellectually, yes. He knew it was against the law. He knew others would disapprove. That is why he attempted to clean up the evidence and delete the video from his phone. But emotionally, morally, he did not believe it was wrong. From his perspective, he was simply solving a problem. Emma annoyed him, so he eliminated her. It was logical and practical from his worldview. Preston cross-examined aggressively. Dr. Torres, is it not true that the criteria for diagnosing personality disorders specifically state that such diagnoses should not be made in children and adolescents? That is true for most personality disorders. But the research on psychopathic traits in juveniles is clear. These traits can be reliably identified in adolescents, and they are highly predictive of future violent behavior. But my client is only 13 years old. His brain is still developing. How can you make such definitive statements about his character? While it is true that the adolescent brain is still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and moral reasoning, the traits Marcus displays are not simply impulse control issues. They are fundamental deficits in his ability to experience human emotion and connection. And the deliberate, planned nature of his crime demonstrates that this was not an impulse. It was a calculated decision executed with precision. The testimony continued, but Torres's assessment was devastating to the defense. He had essentially testified that Marcus was a psychopath who understood his actions but felt no remorse, who was likely to kill again if given the opportunity. As the second week of trial drew to a close, the prosecution began preparing the jury for the smoking gun evidence. They called Officer Sarah Jenkins back to the stand to lay the foundation. Officer Jenkins, you previously testified about items found in the defendant's bedroom. Can you tell us more about the cell phone you recovered? Yes, ma'am. We found the defendant's phone on his desk. It was powered off. When we turned it on, we discovered it had been reset to factory settings just hours after Emma's death. What does a factory reset do? It deletes all user data, all applications, all photos and videos, all text messages, essentially returning the phone to the state it was in when first purchased. Does a factory reset permanently erase data? No. When data is deleted, it is not immediately erased from the physical memory. It is simply marked as available space that can be overwritten by new data. If we can image the device before that space is overwritten, we can often recover deleted files. And were you able to do that in this case? Yes. We sent the phone to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Digital Forensics Laboratory for analysis. They were able to recover a significant amount of data. Including video files? Yes. Chen paused, looking at the jury. Your Honor, at this time the state would like to call FBI Special Agent David Park, Digital Forensics Specialist. Special Agent Park took the stand. He was a man in his 30s with an air of quiet competence. He explained his credentials and his role in the investigation. Agent Park, Chen said, were you able to recover data from the defendant's phone? Yes, ma'am. We used specialized forensic software to create a complete image of the phone's memory. including areas marked as deleted. We were able to recover approximately 85% of the deleted content. And what did you find? We found numerous photos, text messages, and several video files. One video file in particular was flagged for immediate attention. Can you describe this video? Park's expression was grave. Even his professional detachment could not hide his disgust at what he was about to describe. The video is 2 minutes and 43 seconds in length. It was recorded on March 15, 2024, at 7:15 in the evening, approximately 1 hour before police were called to the Holloway residence. The video was deleted at 7:46 in the evening, approximately 30 minutes after it was recorded. What does this video show? Park took a breath. The video is a recording of the murder of Emma Holloway, filmed by the defendant himself. It shows him committing the crime while narrating his actions. His face is clearly visible throughout. There is no question about the identity of the person in the video or the authenticity of the footage. The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. Judge Thornton gavelled for order. Marcus's face went white. For the first time since the trial began, his confident mask cracked completely. He looked like he might be sick. Agent Park, how were you able to verify the authenticity of this video? We conducted extensive forensic analysis. We examined the metadata, which confirmed the date, time, and device used to create the recording. We analyzed the video for signs of editing or manipulation and found none. We verified that the individual in the video was the defendant by comparing facial features, voice patterns, and distinctive characteristics. We confirmed that the location shown in the video matched the crime scene. Every aspect of our analysis confirmed that this video is authentic, unedited, and was created at the time and place indicated by the metadata. What is shown in this video? The video begins with the defendant positioning the camera to capture both himself and the bedroom he shared with his sister. Emma is visible in the background, sitting on her bed, unaware that she is being filmed. The defendant speaks directly to the camera. What does he say? Park consulted his notes, though it was clear he had the words memorized. He says, "This is how you solve a problem. You do not wait for someone else to fix it. You do not hope it gets better. You just do what needs to be done." He then picks up a baseball bat that was off camera and approaches his sister. Emma sees him coming and starts to panic. She asks him what he is doing. He does not respond to her. He just raises the bat. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Every person was focused on Park's testimony with horrible fascination. What happens next? Emma tries to run. She moves toward the door, but the defendant blocks her path. She is crying and begging him to stop, to please not hurt her. He strikes her the first time across her shoulders, knocking her to the ground. The camera captures everything. The defendant had positioned it to ensure a clear view of the entire room. Chen let the horror of that detail sink in before asking, "Does the defendant say anything else during the assault?" Yes. After the first blow, Emma is on the ground, crying and trying to crawl away. The defendant walks back to the camera, looks directly at the lens and says, "See, you just have to commit. You cannot hesitate." Then he returns to Emma and strikes her again and again. Emma is screaming for help, calling for her parents. Between blows, the defendant provides commentary, as if he is narrating an instructional video. Several jury members were crying. Others looked like they were going to be ill. In the gallery, Susan Holloway had fainted. Medical personnel rushed to help her. Judge Thornton called for a recess. "We will break for 1 hour. When we return, we will view the video evidence. Anyone who wishes to leave the courtroom before that happens may do so now." No one left. Despite the horror of what they were about to witness, everyone stayed. During the recess, Preston made one final desperate plea to his client. "Marcus, you need to enter a guilty plea right now. We can try to negotiate something, anything. Once that jury sees that video, there is no coming back from it." Marcus was shaking, his earlier confidence completely gone. "They cannot show that. They cannot. It is private." Preston stared at him incredulously. "Private? You filmed yourself murdering your sister. There is no privacy expectation in recorded evidence of a crime. Marcus, please, you need to listen to me. That video is going to destroy you." "Fix this," Marcus said desperately. "You are my lawyer. Fix this." "I cannot fix this," Preston said quietly. "No one can. You filmed your own crime. You created the evidence that is going to convict you. There is nothing I can do." When the trial resumed, the courtroom lights were dimmed. A large screen had been positioned where everyone could see it. Rebecca Chen stood beside a laptop. "Your Honor, the state is now going to present Exhibit A-47, the video recovered from the defendant's cell phone. I must warn everyone in the courtroom that this video contains extremely graphic content. It shows the murder of a 7-year-old child in explicit detail. Anyone who wishes to leave should do so now." No one moved. "Very well," Judge Thornton said. "You may proceed." Chen pressed play. For the next 2 minutes and 43 seconds, the courtroom was filled with the sounds of a child being murdered, while her brother filmed it and provided narration. The video was everything Agent Park had described and worse. It showed Marcus's face in crystal-clear high definition, his expression one of focus and determination rather than rage or emotion. It showed Emma's terror, her desperate attempts to escape, her pleas for mercy that went unheeded. It captured the moment of each impact, the sound of wood striking bone, the weakening of Emma's cries as the assault progressed. Most horrifying of all was Marcus's commentary. "You have to aim for the head," he said at one point. "That is where you do the most damage." Later, as Emma lay barely conscious on the floor, he adjusted the camera angle to capture a better view and said, "This is the important part. You have to make sure they are really gone. You cannot leave a witness." When the video finally ended with Marcus saying, "Problem solved," and the screen going dark, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then the sound started. Crying from the gallery, a jury member gasping for breath, someone running from the courtroom to vomit in the hallway. Marcus Holloway sat at the defense table, his face drained of all color, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had finally understood that his performance was over. There was no talking his way out of this. No charming the jury. No pretending it was an accident. He had filmed his own crime in such explicit detail that there could be no doubt, no ambiguity, no mercy. Chen let the horror of what they had just witnessed settle before she spoke again. "Your Honor, I believe the video speaks for itself. The state rests." Judge Thornton looked shaken, and she was a woman who had presided over murder trials for 3 decades. "Mr. Preston, does the defense wish to present any witnesses?" Preston stood slowly. "Your Honor, I would like to request a recess to confer with my client." "Granted. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. That night, Preston tried one more time to convince Marcus to accept a guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence without parole. But the district attorney's office had no interest in negotiating. Not after that video. They wanted the death penalty, and they were going to get it. The next morning, Preston presented a brief defense. He called a psychiatrist who testified about adolescent brain development and impulse control. He called a social worker who discussed the importance of rehabilitation for juvenile offenders. But it was all meaningless. The jury had seen the video. They had watched a 13-year-old boy calmly murder his 7-year-old sister while filming it and providing instructional commentary. No amount of expert testimony about brain development could erase that image from their minds. Closing arguments were almost anticlimactic. Chen simply reminded the jury of what they had seen and heard. The defendant filmed himself committing this crime. He showed you exactly who he is. Believe him. Preston did his best, arguing that Marcus was a child who deserved a chance at rehabilitation, but even he sounded defeated. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Marcus Allen Holloway, guilty. Marcus showed no reaction. He had shut down completely, his mind unable to process the reality crashing down around him. Judge Thornton set sentencing for 2 weeks later. The prosecution had made clear they would be seeking the death penalty. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed once again. Emma's family read victim impact statements, describing the bright, loving child they had lost and the devastating impact her murder had had on everyone who knew her. Then it was time for the judge to speak. Marcus was brought to stand before the bench, his wrists and ankles shackled. Judge Thornton looked at him for a long moment before she began. Marcus Holloway, in my 30 years on this bench, I have presided over cases involving every kind of crime imaginable. I have seen crimes of passion, crimes of desperation, crimes committed in moments of rage or fear or confusion. But I have never, in all those years, seen anything like what you did. You did not kill your sister in a moment of anger. You did not hurt her accidentally. You planned her murder. You prepared for it. You thought about it. You fantasized about it. And then you executed your plan with such cold calculation that you actually filmed yourself doing it, creating a permanent record of your depravity because you were so arrogant, so convinced of your own superiority, that you believed you would never face consequences. Marcus's legs were shaking. Tears ran down his face, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. Throughout this trial, you have performed for this court. You have tried to present yourself as a victim, as a confused child, as anything other than what you truly are. You looked into the cameras. You played the part of the innocent boy caught in terrible circumstances. But that video, Mr. Holloway, that video you filmed yourself, destroyed every lie you told. It showed us exactly who you are, not a confused child, not a victim, but a calculating killer who views other human beings as objects to be discarded when they become inconvenient. Judge Thornton's voice grew stronger, more forceful. Your sister was 7 years old. She was a child who should have been able to trust you, to look up to you, to feel safe in her own home. Instead, you terrorized her. You hurt her. And when you decided she was too much trouble, you murdered her in the most brutal way imaginable. You struck her 7 times with a baseball bat. 7 times. She was conscious for at least some of those blows. She felt the pain. She experienced the terror. She knew her own brother was killing her, and she could not understand why. Marcus tried to speak, but no words came out. And even then, even after you had beaten your 7-year-old sister to death, you showed no remorse. You calmly deleted the video from your phone. You cleaned the murder weapon. You went downstairs and told your parents it was an accident, as if the crime scene upstairs could possibly support that lie. You treated your sister's murder like it was a minor inconvenience, something to be explained away and forgotten. Judge Thornton paused, letting her words sink in. This court has a duty to protect society. And you, Marcus Holloway, are a danger to everyone around you. You lack the fundamental capacity for empathy that makes civilized society possible. You see other people only as obstacles or tools. And when someone becomes too much of an obstacle, as your sister did, you simply eliminate them. She picked up the sentencing order. The jury has found you guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution has recommended the death penalty. And after careful consideration, after reviewing all the evidence, after watching that video of you calmly murdering your sister while providing commentary like you were teaching a class, I am going to grant that recommendation. Marcus's knees buckled. A bailiff grabbed his arm to keep him from falling. Marcus Allen Holloway, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and that you be executed by lethal injection at a time and place to be determined according to law. This sentence makes you the youngest person in modern Texas history to face the death penalty, and I want you to understand why. You committed an act of such calculated cruelty that you forfeited your right to live in society. You documented your own crime with such casual disregard for human life that you proved beyond any doubt that you are irredeemable. She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze hard and unflinching. You wanted to be special. You wanted to be superior. You wanted everyone to know how smart you were. Well, Mr. Holloway, you will certainly be remembered, but not as the brilliant mind you imagined yourself to be. You will be remembered as a cautionary tale. You will be remembered as proof that evil can wear a young face. And you will be remembered as the boy who was so arrogant he filmed his own crime and in doing so, sealed his own fate. Judge Thornton paused one final time. Your performance is over, Marcus. The cameras are off, and now you will face the consequences of your actions. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. Marcus collapsed completely, his body going limp as bailiffs held him upright. His screams echoed through the courtroom as he was dragged away, finally understanding, far too late, that his actions had consequences he could not charm or manipulate his way out of. Emma's parents held each other as they watched the boy who had murdered their daughter being led away in chains. There was no satisfaction in the verdict, no sense of victory. Emma was still gone, but there was a sense that justice, harsh and final, had been served. The case became a national sensation. Legal experts debated the ethics of sentencing a juvenile to death. Marcus's appellate attorneys filed motion after motion, but the strength of the evidence, particularly that damning video, made successful appeals unlikely. Marcus himself, confined in a special juvenile death row facility, slowly came to understand the full weight of what he had done. The narcissistic confidence that had sustained him crumbled. He was haunted by nightmares of his sister. The other inmates, even hardened criminals, viewed him with disgust. The guards treated him with cold professionalism. He had no visitors except his attorneys. His parents, destroyed by grief and guilt, could not bear to see him. Years passed. Appeals were filed and denied. Marcus grew older in his cell, from 13 to 14 to 15, watching childhood pass through bars while the date of his execution loomed in an uncertain future. And through it all, that video existed, a permanent record of his crime, a 2-minute and 43-second document of a child being murdered by her brother while he narrated it like an instructional video. It ensured that Marcus Holloway would never be forgotten, never be forgiven, never escape the consequences of the evil he had chosen to commit. The case changed Texas law regarding juvenile offenders. It sparked national conversations about child psychopathy, about warning signs in children, about the limits of rehabilitation. Emma's name became associated with child safety initiatives. Her parents, though destroyed by grief, eventually found purpose in advocacy work, trying to help other families recognize the warning signs they had missed. Marcus Holloway, the boy who had been so certain of his own superiority, who had filmed his crime because he was so confident he would get away with it, became instead a symbol of the consequences of narcissism, cruelty, and evil. His performance had ended, his mask had fallen, and justice, cold and absolute, had been served.